What does Lacan mean by non-existent sexual relation, and how does this concept find its ultimate expression through our fascination with non-human or undead female bodies? Using cinematic examples of the concept of the sexbot, this talk will introduce how sexuation in psychoanalytic sense is intimately linked to the question of speech, body, enjoyment, and technology. Welcome, Isabel Millar.
Hi everyone, thank you Angelina, thank you for being here everyone. So the psychoanalysis of sex robots in 15 minutes, it's going to be tricky, but I will try. I'd like to begin with 3 quotes. The first is by the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. The world is increasingly populated by latuses. The latus has absolutely no reason to limit its multiplications. What is important is to know what happens when one really enters into relationship with the latus as such. The second quote is from philosopher Baudrillard. There is something stronger than passion, illusion. There is something stronger than sex or happiness, the passion for illusion. The third quote is by American writer Don DeLillo. Technology is lust removed from nature. So the truth is, as attention-grabbing as these lovely dolls are, I'm not particularly interested in sex robots. They leave me rather cold. Having said that, I think the concept of the sex robot is fascinating from a psychoanalytic and philosophical perspective. But what do I mean by concept of the sex robot? Well, taken to its speculative zenith, it's an embodied, humanoid AI with whom we enter into a sexual relation, experience physical and emotional enjoyment, who may even become real love objects and in turn may themselves love or enjoy us back. In psychoanalysis, enjoyment or jouissance is a complex term that refers not just to pleasure but also pain and their paradoxical intersection, otherwise known as the death drive, that is definitive of human experience. The idea of AI as love object has fascinated writers and filmmakers for years. Most recently, we can think of, for example, Ex Machina, Blade Runner 2049, Westworld, Black Mirror, among others. And so in my research, which is on the psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence, I use the concept of the sexbot in film to examine larger philosophical questions about our intimate and sexual relations with forms of AI. So what is sex in psychoanalytic terms? Common characterizations of psychoanalysis accuse it of reducing everything to an underlying sexual meaning. But on the contrary, this is to misunderstand what sex is. Sex is not a hidden meaning, but precisely the lack of meaning itself. As philosopher Alenka Zupancic says, it would be a big mistake to consider that in Freudian theory, the sexual, in the sense of constitutively deviational partial drives, is the ultimate horizon of the animal called human. On the contrary, it is the operator of the inhuman, the operator of dehumanization. Unquote. This dehumanization, as she calls it, is significant in relation to our discussion of sex robots as undead companions, since it's from this inhuman basis that psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan constructs his theory of subjectivity around this fundamental negativity we call sex. Zupancic says, what Freud calls the sexual is thus not what makes us human in any received meaning of the term. It is rather that which makes us subject, or perhaps more precisely, it is coextensive with the emergence of the subject. Unquote. The question of sex in Lacanian psychoanalysis has its roots, of course, in Freud's discovery of the unconscious. But Freud's most significant contribution to the question of sex was to claim that our popular conceptions of what sex is were completely wrong. A common misconception about Freud's legacy, which still persists, is that he reduced all the complexity of human life down to banalities of repressed sexual and bodily drives stemming from originary traumas that underpinned all of our subsequent adult desires. While sexuality is at the root of the Freudian conception of human subjectivity, it is not sex in the common sense meaning of the term. Furthermore, whilst Freud may have spoken about sexual trauma as formative to our adult sexual orientation, this trauma is not necessarily one that ever took place in reality. And nor is there such a thing as normative sexuality which could exist without such trauma in the first place. For Freud, the fact of sexuality itself is the inherent trauma of what it is to be a human being. It is how this trauma is navigated which will determine the precise way in which a person will come to inhabit his, her, or their sexuality. And this is what Lacan would formalize logically over many years in his seminar, culminating eventually in terms of his grasp of sexuation. Pictured here. And transitioning from the subject of the unconscious to the fundamentally barred subject, otherwise known as the speaking being. Lacan schematized sexual difference in logical terms as two different ways of constituting a totality using the language of set theory in algebra, also known in psychoanalysis as mathemes. Masculinity and femininity merely being two failed modes in language of reaching the impossible absolute, and giving a sense to his famous refrain, the sexual relation does not exist. This relation does not exist because, to simplify somewhat, symbolically the man has the phallus and the woman is the phallus. Two mutually exclusive positions. For psychoanalysis, the fact that we speak and are castrated by language is the sine qua non of our subjectivity and sexuality, a process which all speaking beings must by definition undergo, and which determines their sexuated position within language and discourse. The term castration here does not refer to the actual removal of the phallic organ, but rather the symbolic operation of entering the realm of language. Our first experience of language, of course, being as a stand-in for something missing that we desperately wanted. A breast, a toy, a person, a look. Language is the mark of the thing that we lacked, and which provides us with the substitute satisfaction in its place. But importantly, this form of understanding sexuation does not conform to genetic or biological models, and therefore does not depend on what type of body you have. These positions within language are highly abstract and correspond to the ways in which the symbolic carves up our bodies and orients our enjoyment. These forms of enjoyment dictate the way in which we experience ourselves as an object for the other, and in return how the other may be an object for us, of enjoyment for us. We don't have time to go into it fully here, but we can simply say that the masculine position corresponds to the all of exception and inclusion. To be on the masculine side, you are characterized by belonging to a closed group which is constituted by an exception in the form of the mythical, totemic and all-enjoying father in Freudian terms. For the masculine sex, all except one are castrated. This totemic father never really existed, but yet as a fantasy he operates. To make it more tangible, think of Donald Trump as the ultimate obscene totemic Freudian father who is permitted to enjoy everything, including, as he insinuates, his own daughter. And in doing so, creates the exception to the rule, creating a category of so-called men. The feminine non-all, in contrast, is an open set which doesn't require a boundary to define itself. There is not one that is not castrated. For this reason, masculinity is, formally speaking, a limit to forms of enjoyment, and femininity is an unlimited mode of enjoyment. Not because women are not subject to castration, but because the function of non-castration does not determine their enjoyment. Think here of the logic of femininity not as something mystical or ineffable, but rather as a formal category which entails an infinite proliferation of possibilities. To give you an image, think of the notion of female enjoyment and its prohibition as the absolute fascination of our culture. We've always been completely obsessed with how women enjoy, as pornography shows. The enjoying body of a woman is the ultimate prize and the ultimate enigma. The strange thing about the two modes of sexuation, however, is that on the masculine side, the category of man is generated as a totality, whereas on the feminine side, the category of woman, logically, simply cannot exist. She's over there and she's crossed out. Since the conditions of her totality are impossible. So what does this have to do with sex robots? At a time when the notion of the technological singularity is hotly debated, we're presented with all kinds of imagined futures wherein the boundaries of humanity and sexuality are redefined and transgressed. Even though actual sexbots are in their infancy, in the present stage of techno-capitalism, their phantasmatic presence in culture betray a long-time fascination with intimate relations with AI more generally. In Lacan's Seminar 17, he famously invented two new terms, the latus and the alethosphere. The alethosphere, from the Greek word aletheia, truth, in contemporary times would refer to the realm of individualized and formalized truth-making that we each plug into in the digitally mediated social sphere. In other words, the self-contained echo chamber of our own ideas and enjoyment, wherein despite our connectivity, we are all profoundly alone. Just think about the lonely desperation of the Twitter sphere, or the deluge of angry men with a dangerous grudge that the internet has spawned. And so this Lathus is this strange object that is, to paraphrase Lacan, not quite being and not quite the other, but is to be found in the guise of the ever-proliferating object A, or object causes of desire, which sustain this self-contained bubble of enjoyment. And what better example of this than the love dolls we're seeing tonight? So rather than a standard feminist critique of the misogynistic aspects of the sex robot industry, which I'm sure we can all imagine, I am more interested rather in what the fantasy of a relationship between a human and an embodied AI, or modern-day Lathus, tells us about subjectivity and sexuation in the alethosphere. Because whether we like it or not, AI is entering the social bond. In the context of Lacanian theory, this impossible relationship is interlinked with the question of knowledge, enjoyment, and sexuation. To quote Lacan, it's a logical articulation that is at stake in the formulation that knowledge is the other's jouissance. The other's, of course, insofar as, since there is no other, the intervention of the signifier makes the other emerge as a field, unquote. So how does this question of non-human or undead sexual companions reflect a far more intractable problem regarding sex, speech, knowledge, and the body? When there is less and less space between demand and fulfillment, we may ask, what is the status of fantasy as a sustaining structure to real life? In psychoanalysis, fantasy is the framework through which we construct our subjectivity, our deepest desires being based around a fictional structure that is constitutively unknown to us. The function of fantasy is in fact the logical framework which allows the subject to become intelligible, and to quote Lacan, the imaginary to be captured by a particular use of signifiers. This leads us to query the logic of fantasy in relation to AI and the different ways sexuation can manifest in fantasies of AI. The enigma of sex, then, is one which we always find right at the heart of fantasies of radical futures for the human species and alternative utopian landscapes, and has recently found expression in various depictions of AI and our sexual relation to it in cinema. Much like the first Blade Runner movie, Denis Villeneuve's 2017 sequel, Blade Runner 2049, asks fundamental questions about the nature of human existence in the context of accelerated techno-capitalism. This time, though, the crux of the protagonist Kay's dilemma is no longer am I human, but was I born? Kay, in searching for the film's object of desire, the missing child, phantasmatically tries to reconstruct his very own primal scene, i.e. the impossible knowledge of his own creation. Kay now starts to believe he is the chosen one, born of the union of man and woman. The enigmatic and profoundly human problem of sexuation is thus brought to the fore. The anxiety depicted here is therefore the disintegration of the illusion of the sexual relation, which according to psychoanalysis never existed in the first place. Since in this imagined future, humans are reproduced artificially and without the need for the work of female gestation, the significance of sexuation becomes ever more conspicuous. Why would we still need so-called men and women if we can reproduce asexually? But whilst Kay is a replica of a male human yet aware of his replicant status, Joy, his holographic girlfriend, played by Ana de Armas, pictured here, is a virtual AI programmed for the sole purpose of being a love interest for her husband, but supposedly unaware of her existential quandary, i.e. that she is not real, that she doesn't exist. Joy is perhaps what Lacan would have referred to as the ultimate Lathus. The Lathus, which Lacan derives from the Greek ousia, meaning being, merged with ventus, the French for suction cup, and vent, wind, evokes a device for siphoning off enjoyment. This illusion we may relate to the voice and breath and the enjoyment of speech involved in feminine jouissance, and which is one of the most tangible features of Joy's character. Joy, in her fully automated luxury femininity, summons up the image of the capitalist dream of woman as pure object A. Joy represents the phallus as pure signifier of castration, an impossible undead body. Reading Slavoj Žižek on the question of the phallus and the body, we could similarly understand Joy's significance thus. Its transcendental status means there is nothing substantial about it. The phallus is the semblance par excellence. What the phallus causes is the gap that separates the surface event from bodily density. It is the pseudo-cause that sustains the autonomy of the field of sense with regard to its true, effective bodily cause. Unquote. It is thus the question of the enjoying body, as depicted between K and his phantasmatic relationship to both his love object and his own idea of his body as born, not made, that provides us with the conceptual transition from the Freudian unconscious to the Lacanian speaking body. K's unconscious becomes a site of contestation via the various discursive modalities that he enjoys through his fantasy of lost or potential enjoyment. His enjoyment is very much predicated on his ability to experience himself phantasmatically via the body of the woman, whether that is his holographic lover, simulacrum of a sister, or dead mother. So sex here is what is missing from the signifying chain, a gap in knowledge. In other words, sex is the very structural incompleteness of nature and of being. In the age of the alethosphere, is this not the point of the sex robot? The possibility to experience ourselves via the body of an impossible other, the body of the woman who doesn't really exist.